A lone car holding a hopeful-looking family of 3 is allowed into the asylum, under the cover of the morning's not-yet-risen sun. The family enter what would be their new home, and the new lady of the house inspects the area curiously. Finding a welcoming bottle of champagne in the fridge, she pours herself a glass, proceeding to explore the rest of the grounds. In her exploration, she finds a decrepit glass greenhouse, and her husband joins her, noting they should get it repaired. With nothing else of note to say, he retires to bed. Despite the husband's profession as a psychologist, the cold and clinical nature of their interaction clearly suggests the transactional nature of their marriage. The next day, the husband, Dr. Max Raphael, is introduced to the staff as the new deputy superintendent during a speech by Jack Straffen, the current superintendent of the hospital. The staff applaud, welcoming him and his wife Stella, and their son Charlie. As her husband leaves her side to schmooze with the other guests, Jack introduces Stella to Dr. Peter Cleve, the longest-serving doctor at the hospital. Peter and Stella are left to make small talk, so she politely asks what his field is. Peter usually deals in extreme cases, and is particularly interested in sexual pathology and its associated catastrophes, which Stella clearly finds fascinating subject matter, and they converse for the rest of the evening at length. Walking home together, Max interrogates Stella on what she spoke to Peter about. But Stella doesn't seem to care to hear his negative opinions. She rather liked Dr. Cleve. Max scolds her for not speaking to any of the other wives for the entire evening, warning her that she will be expected to play her role and be involved in the workings of the hospital. Stella nods her head like an obedient child. The wives gather for a meeting to plan the hospital's annual ball, and once the group is gathered, it's obvious that Stella is the youngest, most beautiful of the women there. Stella, without any volunteering of her own, is assigned to bring the fruitcake when the topic comes up. The wives all look at her expectantly as if it's only natural. A couple of the women give a not-so-subtle reminder that the fruitcake isn't to contain alcohol, alluding to Stella's own casual consumption of liquor during daytime hours. Upon exiting the meeting, Stella spots a line of male patients being guided towards their quarters, and it piques her curiosity. Instead of following the wives out of the correct entrance, Stella begins to explore the corridors of the hospital, and happens across the female ward, where the haunting screams of a woman draw her toward. An elderly patient grabs her through the bars, giving her a startle, and as she scurries away, she bumps into Dr. Cleve, who leads her out of a safer exit. While walking with her, Peter warns that she should stay within the more public areas of the hospital. You never know what you might find in the wards. Stella curiously wonders if the male and female patients ever mix, and the doctor informs her it only happens once a year at the annual hospital ball, which is more than enough for them. At home, Stella offers help Mrs. Bain, their new housekeeper, but she declines the assistance. Bored out of her mind, Stella wonders what her predecessor used to do to occupy her time. According to Mrs. Bain, she used to sew tapestries, but that idea doesn't seem to excite Stella in the least. It's a hobby for old women, after all. One day, Charlie interrupts Stella in the garden, excitedly pulling her to show her the test of strength he invented with one of the workers there. Charlie wants her to time them. Stella tries to stall by saying she doesn't have her watch, not wanting to alarm her son to the fact that the man is actually not just a worker, but a patient. But Charlie insists she counts. The man lifts Charlie as he holds onto the shovel, and Stella nervously counts as his dark eyes stare into hers. She makes it to 16 before they are interrupted by security, and the family scurry back to safety. At dinner, Stella mentions Charlie's new friend to Max, curious about the man. She's informed that Charlie is perfectly safe. Working at the hospital is considered a privilege, and all the patients are thoroughly vetted before they are allowed to do so. Max reveals that the man isn't his patient but Dr. Cleve's, his favorite, in fact. Apparently, it isn't uncommon for doctors to have a pet patient, which makes Stella wonder who Max's favorite patient is. Stella keeps pressing for details about the man, learning that he is a sculptor, but Max refuses to give up any more than that, reassuring Stella that Charlie is safe, which is all that matters in his eyes. The next day, Stella goes to visit the man while he works on the glass greenhouse, apologizing to him for possibly getting him into trouble yesterday. He guarantees her there's no harm done, but she doesn't leave immediately after that, lingering outside the greenhouse. Dr. Cleve, on his way to the greenhouse, spots them chatting and stays hidden. She finds out he's been in the asylum for 6 years, committed for murdering his wife, who he believes betrayed him. One day, the patient comes in carrying Charlie, unconscious with a bleeding temple, in his arms. According to him, Charlie fell while climbing a tree, so the man brought him back for treatment. Charlie thanks him as he wakes, asking his parents if Edgar, the patient, could stay for tea, but Edgar leaves to get back to work. Some time after, Edgar approaches Stella while she works in the garden, to check up on how Charlie's recovering. The two don't chat very long, but the conversation feels very intimate, even bordering on flirtatious. That night, while on their way to the ball, Max notes Stella's dress for the evening is a tad much, considering the event. But Stella plays it off all very casually in her usual fashion, giving Max an answer he will be satisfied with, just to shut him up. Once inside, the two put on their usual act of presenting a united front. But once again, Max leaves to schmooze, and Stella is left standing alone. As a waltz begins to play, Edgar approaches Stella and quietly asks her to dance. She obliges. Dr. Cleve notices them and checks to see if her husband has too. He hasn't, so he leaves the two to their own devices. As they dance, Stella is alarmed by the signals his body gives off when they embrace, knowing fully well what it means. But she goes back to dancing with him anyway, giving him a sort of unspoken consent or confirmation that the feelings are mutual. When Max gets into bed that night, he excitedly reveals to Stella that Jack soon plans to retire, and that Max is in line to be his successor. Stella congratulates him. As Stella reclines in the garden the next day, Edgar approaches her, handing her a bouquet of flowers, thanking her for allowing him the honor of a dance with her. But Stella cannot accept. Edgar leaves her the flowers anyway, hoping she'll at least accept their meaning. From inside the house, Stella watches Edgar as he plays sword fight with Charlie, bonding with her son in the way she wishes his father would, even paying attention to her in the way she wishes he would, too, and contemplates her impending decision. She dresses in just the right outfit for the deed, suiting up with a woman's most powerful accessory, red lipstick, and makes her way over to the glass house. There, she walks in on Edgar, interrupting his work, and with no words exchanged beforehand, he takes her right there on the floor of the decrepit building. Being his first time in presumably 6 years, it's over quite quickly, and Stella gets up, shakes herself off and quickly scurries back to the house. This is where their affair begins. Stella would start regularly finding herself sneaking off for intimate affairs with Edgar as he worked, whenever she could. They would often have to be quick, remain hidden, and keep on the lookout for guards, but the pleasure and passion they share is irresistible to them both. During a checkup one day, Dr. Cleve asks Edgar how he's finding Mrs. Raphael, alluding to the fact that he's aware of what's going on. But Edgar plays innocent, maintaining that he only gave her flowers because she's kind to him, and danced with her at the ball to show the good doctor that he could behave himself with a woman. Edgar hopes that in time, his good behavior in labor will lead to his release, but the doctor doesn't want to rush that quite just yet, aware of how some patients can try to fake getting well in order to be released sooner. He encourages Edgar to keep up the good work, and they will keep up the observation. Needless to say, Edgar isn't happy about this, but doesn't show that in front of the doctor. Brenda Raphael, Max's mother, is visiting this weekend, and as Max chauffeurs her to their home, she asks him how Stella's been behaving herself lately. Jack, Max, Peter and their respective counterparts enjoy a dinner in the evening, and Edgar happens to come up in conversation. Jack compliments the work he's done on the Raphael's glass house, while Mrs. Straffen notes that he happens to be quite attractive. Peter's date, out of the loop, is informed what he's in for, and Stella poses the question of what's eventually to become of him. Peter suggests he'll be overhauling the Rockeries for many years to come, and Stella makes a rather tasteless, sarcastic comment about locking him up and throwing away the key, which, despite their inhumane gossip about Edgar, the dinner party don't take kindly to. Later, Max berates her for her lack of tact, reminding her that it's not her place to have an opinion on policy, wishing she would just behave herself like the other ladies. The next day, Edgar sneaks into the house, finding Stella in her bedroom after noticing that she hasn't come to visit. She knows it's a terribly risky idea to have their affair in her house, in her bed, but she can't say no to Edgar, who gently nudges his way in, closing the door behind him. Brenda has just left the house with Charlie, who she'll be taking for the weekend, but is forced to turn around and return to the house when she notices she's forgotten her pocketbook. Stella and Edgar are mid-copulation when she hears the door bang open, and the couple rush to dress themselves. Stella shows herself at the door, giving that excuse she just had a bath, before Brenda has even asked or said anything to her. Her mother-in-law ignores her, searching for her checkbook while Edgar sneaks out behind Stella, but on his way out the door, he passes Charlie, whom he whispers to keep quiet. The young boy is scared and confused, and just as he's going upstairs to his mother for some clarity, his grandmother locates her belongings and ushers him out the door again. Fearing the worst, now that Charlie knows, Stella gets dressed and goes to see Edgar at the glass house, but when she arrives, he's not there. Meanwhile, young Charlie sits in the passenger seat, anxious about what he's seen. Noticing his pale expression, his grandmother inquires what's wrong. Innocently, Charlie confesses he saw a patient in the house that may have been in his mummy's bedroom, but lies about knowing who it is. Brenda brings the car to a screeching halt, quickly interrogating the child for more details, and during this halt, Edgar crawls his way out of her trunk, sneaking along the side of the car. She gets out to shut the trunk that mysteriously popped open, and Charlie spots Edgar but raises no alarm, pretending he didn't see him, which allows Edgar to crawl into the bushes, escaping further. Meanwhile, Stella sits at home anxiously smoking, as she knows that the news will break eventually. A security guard comes in asking to use her phone, and soon, the alarm sounds. The couple are brought before Jack to answer some questions, as the allegations of Stella and Edgar's salacious relationship cannot be denied any longer. He lays out the evidence, including several eyewitness reports of flirtatious actions by John Archer, one of the security guards, as well as multiple patients. When asked, Stella acts as though all her interactions with Edgar were completely innocent. But when Jack reports to Dr. Cleve and the other administrators, he confirms that the allegations are true, seeing through Stella's poorly formulated lies. Jack is furious that such a scandal would happen in his last year, that Brenda would be so unattentive, that Max would be so inept at controlling his wife, and that Stella would be so remarkably stupid. Cleve convinces Jack to leave the details about the illicit love affair out of the news, let the hospital save some face for a bit. A madman on the loose is sensationalism enough for the public. Their co-worker wonders if Stella perhaps helped Edgar to escape, and Dr. Cleve admits that she may well have. Though not on purpose, she was manipulated, and he theorizes Stella's in love with him. Max accuses Peter of being fixated on Edgar, which is why he would pass him as fit for work, when Cleve reminds him that his wife destabilized his patient, and there was no way anyone could have foreseen that. Max assumes Peter's been sent to pick up his resignation letter, but Peter cares not for his grandiosity, advising he get his work done quietly so as to avoid any further embarrassment while he remains at the hospital. During Charlie's bath time, he tries playing a game to see how long he can hold his breath underwater, but when he comes up, he realizes his mother's neglected to time him. Stella's in a complete daze, wondering about Edgar. Charlie asks if he'll be in trouble if they catch him, and Stella solemnly nods. Ever the optimist, Charlie confidently states that he doesn't think they'll catch Edgar, who he imagines is already on a boat back to Australia. The thought makes Stella smile. Stella stares longingly at the empty, half-finished glass house when Peter approaches her, offering a therapeutic ear, unofficially, of course. Stella recoils at the suggestion, though Peter truly wants to help her. Stella soaks in the bath, trying to wash her sordid thoughts of the tortured artist away, when the phone rings. At dinner that night, she informs Max that she'll be going into town tomorrow morning for Christmas shopping. The next morning, she takes a train to London and sits waiting for someone at a restaurant. Just as she's about to leave, a man sits at her table, introducing himself as Nick, the person she spoke to on the phone. Nick was Edgar's art assistant before the murder. Nick drives Stella to a spot in an old building that Edgar has holed up in. Edgar apologizes to Stella for seeming as though he abandoned her, explaining that he couldn't contact her till it was safer. The two share a passionate embrace to celebrate their reunion. Stella returns home that night, not a hair seemingly out of place, and lets Max know she'll be going to London next week once again to collect the gift she ordered for him. Though of course, the next week, she's back in Edgar's bed. One night, Max becomes suspicious about her shopping trips and interrogates her as to where the items she bought are. Stella simply explains she's hidden them, as they're for Christmas, but not believing her, Max screams at her, demanding she show him. Furiously offended, Stella grabs the shoes she bought him out of their hiding place in the closet and tosses them at him with indignation. Max feels terrible for his assumption and begs Stella's forgiveness, initiating a bout of lovemaking to make up for his transgression. One day, while getting redressed after a tussle with Edgar, he wonders if Max suspects anything between them, and if he and Stella share a bed. Stella reassures Edgar she's his, but Edgar insists that he can't share her anymore. He issues an ultimatum to Stella to either leave her family or not come back to him at all. As Stella sits smoking in the garden, contemplating her decision, Dr. Cleve approaches her asking how Edgar is doing, revealing that he knows they've been in contact, thanks to her housemaid letting it slip that Stella's been having frequent shopping trips to London lately. Peter attempts to shake Stella out of the delusion that she's in love with some sort of tortured genius, sharing the gruesome details of how Edgar murdered and mutilated his wife. Peter alludes to the fact that with Max's consent, they could hold Stella in the hospital, gently threatening her with confinement in order to coax Edgar's location out of her. But instead it just scares her away, encouraging her to pack a bag and sneak out of the house. She meets with Edgar, who's overjoyed she's chosen him over her family. Meanwhile, Max is forced to lie to his son about Stella's whereabouts, telling her she's gone on a little holiday. Charlie, not as unaware as his father thinks, asks if his mother's gone to Australia. Stella has a wonderful time with Edgar and Nick. Their days are filled with drinking, dancing, laughter, and lovemaking. Edgar begins using Stella as a model for his sketches and sculptures, but as time passes, the lust of their relationship fades, and Edgar becomes increasingly obsessed with his work. One day, after being ignored for his sculpting yet again, Stella takes a walk into town to clear her head. While shopping at the market, she notices Nick, who she quickly figures out has been sent to follow her. She returns to their makeshift home, furious with Edgar for having her followed, and in disbelief that he has so little trust in her. He quickly dismisses her with a half-hearted apology, absorbed in his sculpture, and Stella slams one of his sculptures down. Fed up with his constant working, she claims it's no different from being with her husband. The mention of her husband triggers Edgar, who gets up to pay her the attention she so desperately wants. The trio have a Christmas party, but as Stella shows off their makeshift cake, Edgar notices she's sad. Stella admits she misses Charlie, and Edgar comforts her as best he can. Nick, the third wheel, watches them dance together. Later that night, Nick confesses to Stella that he loves her, admitting that he loves Edgar as well. The two share a tender moment, kissing each other innocently on the cheek. But Edgar, hearing this, is enraged and assaults Nick, threatening to murder him the next time he touches Stella. The next day, as Edgar is gone, Nick begins clearing out his things to leave, and Stella begs him to stay. Nick begs her to come with him. Edgar is turning, and he's seen the change in behavior before with his wife. Nick confides that he saw the body and pleads with Stella not to stay. Stella paces up and down, wondering what to do. When Edgar enters, he interrogates her on her intentions to go to Nick, but instead she answers by asking if Edgar will start hurting her now too. Edgar bangs his head, struggling with his guilt and impulses, and Stella feels compassion for his tortured soul, choosing to remain in the prison she's built for herself with him. One day when out shopping, Nick discreetly grabs her attention and they meet in a small cafe. Crying, Stella confides that Edgar needs help, pleading with Nick to assist her in finding a doctor. Nick agrees to try his best, holding her hand to comfort her. Edgar, who was following Stella, sees their meeting from outside of the cafe. When Stella returns to the hideout, Edgar immediately her, punching her in the face, and reveals that he's found out about her betrayal, assuming that Nick and Stella are sleeping together. He sharpens a knife as he stands over her, and cutting one of the apples she's just bought, forcefully feeds it to her to make sure she hasn't poisoned them, the way his previous wife tried to. The next day when Stella returns to the hideout, she finds that police officers have discovered it. She attempts to flee, but is caught and apprehended and escorted out by an officer, a scene Edgar catches a glimpse of on his way back in. Max visits Stella in her holding cell, simply informing her that she'll be released in the morning. She asks to see Charlie, and while Max is clearly tempted to exert his right to never have Stella see their son again, he acknowledges her importance to him as a mother and announces she'll be allowed to see him tomorrow. Reporters hound the couple as the Raphaels exit the police station the next day. Dr. Cleve visits Edgar in Stella's little home, doing some personal investigation. While there, he steals a small hand-carved bust of Stella that Edgar made. Meanwhile, Max updates Stella on what their current situation is. Once the news hit the papers, Max lost his job and most of his credibility in England, which is now forcing the family to move to Wales, where he's managed to secure a position at a local hospital. As it turns out, Jack wasn't the one who fired Max, but his successor, Dr. Peter Cleve. Peter adds the bust of Stella to his new desk. The Raphaels arrive at their new, humble home in Wales, greeted by an unhappy Brenda. Stella visits Charlie in his room, who innocently asks his mother if she's all better. Stella promises her son that she'll never leave again, apologizing to him. Later, she thanks Max for allowing her to see Charlie again, though he believes a stronger man would have let her rot. Stella thinks he's strong, but Max just considers her being trite. He obviously isn't strong enough to keep her. Stella spends her time in Wales trying to take in the fresh air and reconnect with her son, who feels somewhat estranged from her. He won't even accept hugs from her when she drops him off at school. She drowns her sorrows in alcohol. Max can't stand to see it anymore, and one day implores Stella that the family can no longer keep living like this, begging her to come back to them as a proper wife and mother again. The phone at the hospital rings, and one of the female administrators answers. She's asked questions about Dr. Raphael's current whereabouts, and noting the conversation, Peter opts to take the call. However, when he begins to speak, the caller goes silent. His intuition and sharp knowledge of his patient tell him that it's Edgar. Peter calls Max and gives him a heads up about the situation, while also inquiring about Stella's current state. Max reassures Peter that Stella is doing just fine. She doesn't even need to be medicated. Stella picks Charlie up from school, and he's notably less jovial than the other students. Getting into the car, Charlie tells his mom that there's a school field trip next week, but lies about parents being allowed to come. When they get home, to Charlie's surprise, the house is clean, and there's an array of baked pastries waiting to greet him on the table, just like old times. Charlie joins his mother in repainting one of the bedrooms, and quietly admits to her that he lied about the field trip. Instead of scolding him, Stella understands, gently reassures him that everyone lies occasionally, and thanking her son for coming forward with the truth. She kindly asks her son if he'd like company on the trip, attempting to respect his boundaries, and he accepts. The two hug, finally feeling the beginnings of reconciliation. Edgar makes his arrival in Wales, surveying Max's new workplace. Meanwhile, Max, lying in bed with Stella, tries to convince her, or himself, that she'll never see Edgar again, that they'll be a family again, like before, and that in time, it'll be all she wants. Edgar breaks into the hospital, locating the Raphaels' new contact information. The next morning, as the Raphael family gets ready to leave the house and Charlie grabs his things for school, the phone rings, and Stella answers. When she gets to the car, she explains to Max it was Charlie's teacher with instructions for their field trip. Later, though, she commandeers the car to a seemingly random patch of Welsh ruins in the middle of nowhere. Getting out of the car and exploring the ruined building, Edgar reveals himself to her. The couple embrace briefly before Edgar tries to get Stella to run away again, but she turns him down. She'll always love him, but she promised never to leave Charlie again. Edgar doesn't see it as a problem, suggesting they'll simply go pick Charlie up at school. But before he can finish the thought, the couple are surrounded by multiple police officers. Edgar attempts to flee, but he can't outrun them. The officers take him down and put him in cuffs, while also restraining Stella, who tries to throw herself in the way. Back at home, as Max finishes dealing with the officers and sending them away, the first thing he does when he enters the house is calmly assure Stella that Edgar is gone, and in a rage, orders Stella to finally let him go. Stella accompanies Charlie to his field trip as planned, but she's not herself, in a complete daze the entire trip down. As the parents and children arrive at their destination, the teacher asks them to split into groups, with at least one adult each, and reminds the children to collect interesting objects in their jars. Stella and Max, being the awkward outsiders, aren't immediately coalesced into a group and are left to wander as a pair. Seeing as Stella should be the responsible adult, however, she's so out of it that Charlie has to take the lead, guiding her along with the rest of the groups. They wander along the edge of the river in a forested area, and Charlie excitedly announces that he wants to try catching a little fish. Stella sits on a rock on the shore while Charlie enters the river, dipping and searching for a fish, when he suddenly slips, falling into the deeper water. Stella sits there, staring right at Charlie drowning, as though she can't see anything, or as though everything is normal. The teacher spots what's happening and comes barreling down the hill, screaming at Stella to do something, anything, but she just sits there stoically, as if she can't hear him. Even when he runs right past her, diving into the water to try to save Charlie himself, all the while still yelling for help, she doesn't move an inch. It's only when she sees the teacher come up with Charlie in his arms that she magically snaps out of it, running to the edge of the water to help them, with the sense of urgency she should have had 5 minutes ago. Stella watches Charlie's funeral from the back of a police car. As the mourners leave, Bertie commends Peter on his quick handling of the arrangements he made for Max in these trying times, before the Straffman couple offers their condolences to him. Max seems to be strong, until Jack hugs him, and he breaks into desperate sobs in the man's arms. Turning his grief into rage, Max marches over to the car, clinically explaining to Stella what's about to happen to her. The shock will wear off, only to be replaced by devastating grief, then she'll just be very, very sad. And that sadness will stay with her for the rest of her life. It isn't a curse, it's a diagnosis. Trying to prevent further trauma to his newest patient, Peter slams the car door on Max. Stella is soon escorted through the walls of the same hospital she met Edgar in, only now, on the patient's side of things. She's scrubbed down, up, and Peter arrives to personally put her to bed. She whimpers, wanting her picture of Charlie, wondering if she isn't allowed to have it because she is the reason he passed. As her brain grapples with the reality of that fact, she starts to sob hysterically, and Peter sedates her. As he tucks her in, drowsily she asks where Edgar is, and Peter assures her he's in the past. The next day, Peter visits Edgar in solitary, yet again trying to coax him to talk. He attempts to bait him with information about Stella, telling him she's there, and what happened to Charlie, but Edgar doesn't bite, or even blink when Peter offers him a chance to see her. Infuriated, Peter goes to check on his other pet patient, Stella. He checks on if she's done her homework, asking a few interview questions, and Stella gives all the right answers that a shrink would want to hear. She realizes now that it wasn't real, it was just an obsession. She has no feelings towards him. Peter tests the waters, dropping a hint that Edgar is there in the hospital and observing Stella's body language, which immediately became alert at the mention, but then convinces her it's a hypothetical situation. One day, Stella is sent to Peter's office, where he offers her a drink, being more casual than usual. He cuts to the chase with Stella, letting her know that he visited and spoke to Max yesterday, who agrees with his plan. Peter wants to arrange to have Stella released, however, he can only do so if she agrees to his continued treatment and observation. Peter is confident these conditions can be met if Stella were to marry and live with him. Stella tries to decline by saying she's still married to Max, but Max informed Peter yesterday that he wants to divorce her. Peter doesn't want to assume that she'd be in love with him, but he claims that she needs him right now, and he hopes that in time, perhaps that need could grow to something like love. Peter tells Edgar of his engagement, which finally prompts him to speak. Later, while on the roof of the hospital, he offers Stella his mother's ring. While on their way back, Stella mentions the hospital ball. She seems apprehensive to attend at first, coyly baiting Peter into confessing the truth of Edgar being there at the hospital, on the basis that their new marriage shouldn't be founded on lies. He confesses the truth and reveals that Edgar will be at the dance, mentioning that it would be helpful to his recovery to see that Stella has moved on, all the while knowing fully well that she hasn't. Edgar begs Peter to let him see Stella, and he dangles the opportunity of the hospital ball in his face as well, giving him hopes of seeing her. Stella wears the exact same dress she wore to the last hospital ball, and Peter compliments her as any gentleman should, reserving a dance with her for later. While on the floor, he notes her behavior as she obsessively looks around the room for Edgar. Peter interrupts Edgar as he's being guided to the dance, preventing him from attending, while Stella's anticipation for Edgar builds as the band plays the same song they danced to at the last ball. She looks around expectantly for him, thinking she saw him for a moment, but instead, Peter approaches her for the dance instead. Peter tells Stella that Edgar was asleep when he went to fetch him, claiming he changed his mind and didn't want to come, while Edgar sobs in his cell, presumably having been told a similar story about Stella's feelings. After the dance is over and the patients are being escorted back to their rooms, Stella calmly makes a turn off, heading down a separate hallway. She takes off the ring Peter gave her, dropping it to the floor, and ceaselessly, without pause, makes her way to the roof of the hospital. With no hesitation, she walks to the edge of the roof, throwing. As the medics rush to her side, Peter kneels next to her in time to hear her last words to him, "Leave me alone." Peter is left to swallow his horror at the consequences of his actions, and Edgar is left hollow, to spend his remaining days at the asylum. Stella is buried next to Charlie, in a far less grandiose grave. Max leaves a single flower out of the entire bouquet he's brought for his son on her grave. The juxtaposition of their resting places shows the displacement and his amount of caring for each of them. Peter stares at the miniature bust of Stella on his desk, the only part of her that he'll ever have.